Birmingham, Alabama, 1963, a city where the air itself seemed to hold its breath, thick with smoke, hymns, and unspoken threats. The nation was trembling through the tremors of the civil rights movement, and beneath the red brick skyline, 4 little girls prepared for Sunday service in a place meant to be safe, the 16th Street Baptist Church. Outside, the streets hummed with the tension of marches and the brutal resistance of those who clung to hatred like a second skin. And deep in the shadows, members of the Ku Klux Klan moved silently. Carrying a weapon meant not only to kill, but to shatter the soul of a community already stretched thin by grief. In those days, Birmingham was known by another name, Bombingham, a place where black homes, churches, and lives were ripped apart by dynamite, meant to halt the rising tide of freedom. Yet even in that world of sirens and funerals, there remained a spirit that refused to bend. People woke each morning knowing danger could steal through their doors, but they also rose with the same steady faith their ancestors carried through darker times. Inside the church basement, soft light spilled onto the walls as the girls laughed and straightened their dresses, unaware that history was tightening its fist around them. This is the story of an explosion that tried to break a people and instead ignited a fire of unity, faith, and righteous fury across America. A story where tears became a language of defiance and the shattered bricks of a church became the stepping stones toward justice. Here in the heart of Birmingham, grief did not sink a community. It sharpened its resolve, shaping a legacy that still echoes through every march, every hymn, every demand to be seen as fully human. The morning sun rose slowly over Birmingham, casting soft gold across the red brick steps of the 16th Street Baptist Church, as if trying to offer warmth before the world turned cold. Inside, Matibos sanctuary swelled with the familiar scent of polished wood, pressed cotton, and the faint sweetness of perfume that lingered from the women who had arrived early to set the choir robes in order. The air carried the hum of anticipation, a Sunday morning rhythm that made people feel, if only briefly, protected from the dangers waiting beyond the church doors. Children drifted through the hallways with the careless joy of innocence, their footsteps echoing lightly along the stone floors, unaware that beneath those same floors, a hidden device ticked in the darkness like a heartbeat out of time. Reverend Cross stood near the front pew, adjusting the church bulletin with hands that trembled ever so slightly, not from fear, but exhaustion, the kind carried by a shepherd watching wolves move closer each passing week. He had spent the last months burying men beaten in alleys, mothers who had collapsed under the weight of endless grief, and teenagers whose courage in the streets had marked them for brutality. Yet every Sunday, he watched his congregation choose hope over surrender, walking through the doors dressed in their best, standing tall as though faith itself were armor. Behind him, the choir began practicing a hymn, their voices rising in soft, fragile harmonies that brushed against the stained glass windows like a prayer perched on the edge of a storm. Down in the basement, 4 young girls clustered together, smoothing ribbons in their hair, adjusting the delicate lace at their collars, and whispering secrets between shy bursts of laughter. Addie Mae, Denise, Carol, and Cynthia carried the soft light of childhood in their smiles, a light so pure that even the tired walls seemed to glow with it. They spoke about the Youth Day service, about school, about growing up in a world that both feared and needed them. None of them noticed the faint vibration beneath the floor, the almost imperceptible hum of wires coiled with hatred. Outside, a passing car slowed for a moment, its engine rumbling low, then continued down the street. Inside, time slipped forward, quiet and merciless, drawing the girls closer to a moment that would reshape the nation. Outside, Birmingham moved with the uneasy rhythm of a city divided against itself. Police cruisers rolling slow through black neighborhoods, shopkeepers watching the sidewalks as though danger wore brown skin, and the distant clang of construction echoing through streets still scarred by past bombings. Yet on this morning, the city felt strangely still, as if holding its breath. A man in a work coat lingered near the alley beside the church, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He glanced once toward the basement windows, then walked away with a hurried stiffness, leaving behind nothing but boot prints and the faint scent of gasoline carried by the wind. No one noticed him leave. No one saw the way his shoulders trembled, not with guilt, but with the cold excitement of cruelty. Inside, the basement walls hummed softly with life, the rustle of pages, the faint echo of footsteps from upstairs, and the nervous excitement of children preparing to speak before the congregation. Addie May traced her finger along the edge of her Bible, rehearsing the scripture she planned to read, whispering each word with the earnest determination only a child could hold. Denise stood beside her, tugging gently at a loose ribbon, dreaming of the moment she would step into the sunlight-filled sanctuary and see her mother smiling from the second pew. The other girls giggled as they practiced their lines, their voices rising and falling like a flock of birds testing their wings. Above them, the choir's warm harmonies drifted down the stairwell, wrapping the basement in a cocoon of sound that felt safe, almost heavenly. But beneath the hymn's gentle rise, beneath the girls' laughter and the murmur of Sunday morning footsteps, there was another presence, silent, hidden, patient. The bomb sat tucked into the far corner beneath the steps, a crude nest of wires and hatred placed by hands that feared the power of black innocence more than any march or protest. Its timer advanced one notch, then another, clicking so softly it blended into the natural pulse of the building. Outside, a sharp gust of wind rattled the basement windows, pushing dust through the cracks in the frame. Inside, the girls barely noticed, lost in the small joys of childhood. Time crept forward, steady as breath, carrying them toward a moment that would shatter far more than brick and glass. The sanctuary above vibrated gently with life as families filed into the pews, their Sunday clothes brushing softly against the polished wooden benches. Mothers carried babies wrapped in freshly pressed blankets. Fathers clasped hymnals with the posture of men who refused to bow to fear. And elders moved slowly down the aisles with the grace of those who had survived too many storms to be shaken by the threat of another. Light streamed through the stained glass windows, scattering red and gold across the faces of worshippers like a quiet blessing. The church felt alive, a refuge built not of brick and stone, but of breath, memory, and faith. And yet beneath the warmth of that gathering, a fragile unease flickered like a candle trembling in a draught, sensed but never spoken aloud. Down in the basement, the girls gathered their belongings, smoothing the folds of their dresses as they prepared to join the service upstairs. Carol pointed toward the mirror propped against the wall, laughing softly as she teased Cynthia about her crooked bow. Their laughter echoed like bells, bright and warm, rising through the stairwell and brushing the edges of the sanctuary. Addie May lifted her Bible and held it to her chest, breathing deeply as if trying to steady her small heart for the moment she would speak before a room full of adults. The door at the top of the steps swung open, allowing a burst of organ music to drift downward, rich and vibrant, filling the room with a feeling of holy anticipation. For a moment, everything felt suspended, as though time itself paused to watch these four souls standing on the threshold between childhood and history. Then, the sound came, a low, trembling rumble that seemed at first like the groan of shifting earth, a noise so faint the girls barely turned their heads. But in the hidden corner beneath the staircase, wires tightened, heat swelled, and hatred found its breath. The first vibration rippled through the floorboards, shaking the dust from old beams. Above them, the choir's voices lifted in a crescendo, their harmonies rising just as the basement lights flickered. Addie May frowned, glancing toward the ceiling, sensing a change in the air, a heaviness, a strange stillness that pressed against her chest. Outside, a bird launched from the church's eaves in sudden flight, startled by something unseen. Inside, the clock in the hall ticked once, twice, and the world drew itself inward, gathering breath in the single heartbeat before everything changed. The rumble deepened, rolling through the walls with the slow, ominous weight of something waking in the dark. In the sanctuary, a few heads lifted, eyes narrowing slightly as the organ's final note faded into an uneasy silence. Reverend Cross paused mid-step, his hand resting on the edge of the pulpit as though the wood itself had whispered a warning. warning. The floor seemed to tremble beneath his shoes, faint, almost imagined, a subtle shifting that brushed against his senses like a cold fingertip trailing down his spine. A mother in the third pew reached instinctively for her child's hand, unable to explain why the hairs on her arms had risen. Even the stained glass windows, usually alive with color, appeared, suddenly muted, as though the light passing through them had grown cautious. Downstairs, the girls stood still for half a beat, their laughter fading as they glanced around the room. Cynthia tilted her head toward the staircase, her expression tightening with confusion. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, though the others could barely distinguish sound from vibration. The basement lights flickered again, this time longer, their glow thinning before returning with a faint buzz that scraped the air. Addie May stepped closer to Denise, her small fingers curling around her friend's wrist in a gesture both questioning and protective. A deep quiet settled in the room, not peaceful, but watchful, like the hush before lightning cracks open the sky. Dust drifted downward from the beams, tiny specks spinning in the stillness like ashes from a fire no one had yet seen. Outside, the city shifted in subtle ways, a dog barking sharply and then falling silent, a passing pedestrian pausing mid-stride as though sensing a change in the wind. The clouds overhead parted briefly, allowing a blade of sunlight to cut across the church's brick facade, illuminating the steps where the girls would have stood moments later. And then, deep beneath the staircase, the bomb reached its final second. The device, wired with precision born of malice, tightened its grip around the air, compressing the world into a single, razor-thin moment. All at once, everything held. Its breath, the sanctuary above, the basement below, the very earth beneath Birmingham, suspended in the fragile, trembling space between innocence and devastation. The explosion tore through the basement in an instant, a violent blossom of heat and pressure that shattered wood, brick and silence alike. It rose like a scream turned inside out, ripping through the floorboards and hurling splinters through the air with the force of a storm breaking its chains. A flash of white light, a cut across the room, swallowing the girls in its fury before they even had time to gasp. The walls buckled, the staircase collapsed, and a wave of dust surged upward like a dark tide. In the sanctuary, stained glass windows burst in a rain of color that scattered across the pews like fallen stars. Smoke spiraled through the air in choking ribbons, carrying the thick smell of burning plaster and destruction. In the space where laughter had lived moments before, there was now only the roar of ruin. Parents leapt from their seats as the floor heaved beneath them, their screams lost in the ringing that filled every ear. Mothers stumbled toward the stairwell, their hands outstretched, their voices torn with terror as they called the names of their daughters. Fathers tried to push through the smoke, collapsing as debris fell from the ceiling in thundering chunks. Reverend Cross fought against the tide of panicked bodies, his face streaked with dust, his voice raw as he shouted for calm that would not come. The sanctuary, once a home for hymns and whispered prayers, was now a battlefield of overturned pews and shattered glass. The air burned with heat, grief, and the terrible clarity of understanding something unspeakable had happened below. Somewhere in the haze, a piece of stained glass lay on the floor, the image of an angel's face fractured into 100 glittering tears. Outside, passers-by froze as the ground trembled beneath their feet, followed by a column of smoke rising from the church, as if the earth itself had been wounded. The blast echoed through the streets, rolling off brick walls and ricocheting through alleyways, until it seemed the entire city had been struck. Cars screeched to a stop, doors flung open as people ran toward the growing crowd gathering on the corner. Some fell to their knees, others lifted trembling hands to their mouths, and from within the swirling smoke, voices rose, not the voices of children, but the shattered cries of those who loved them. Sirens wailed in the distance, their mournful song racing toward the church as the city of Birmingham exhaled in terror, realizing that another bomb had found its mark. But this time, it had hit the heart. The smoke poured from the ruptured doorway in heavy grey billows, carrying with it the fine grit of pulverized brick and the bitter scent of burning insulation. Men in their Sunday suits tore off their jackets, covering their mouths as they crawled toward the basement entrance, their hands sweeping blindly across rubble in search of any sign of life. Each movement sent clouds of dust spiraling into the air, turning the morning light into a hazy blur that made the broken church feel suspended somewhere between earth and heaven. A deacon pressed his ear to the cracked floorboards, praying to hear even the faintest cry. But beneath the wreckage there was only the steady settling of ruins, the soft, merciless whisper of falling debris, burying what had once been joy. A mother collapsed near the base of the stairs, her knees striking the floor hard enough to bruise as she clawed at the shattered wood with trembling fingers. Her breath came in ragged bursts, half choked by dust, half crushed by dread, as she called her daughter's name again and again, until her voice broke into sobs. Another woman held her shoulders, trying to steady her, though her own hands shook so violently she could barely keep her grip. Reverend Cross knelt beside them, his eyes red from smoke, his throat raw, as he whispered prayers meant to steady the living while he wrestled with the horror of what he feared awaited below. Behind him, the sanctuary that had once echoed with hymns now pulsed with the sound of weeping, deep, guttural, ancient, a wail as old as suffering itself. When the firemen finally burst through the church doors, their boots hammered against the floor like the drums of an approaching storm. They moved quickly, their shouts cutting through the chaos as they lifted beams, overturned shattered furniture, and carved a path into the smoking darkness below. Onlookers pressed against one another outside, unable to tear their eyes away from the rising smoke curling into the bright sky like a torn piece of night. Faces streaked with soot, and tears watched, helpless, as the rescuers disappeared into the hole where the staircase had once stood. The crowd waited, holding their breath, gripping hands, clutching prayers, until at last, through the haze, a single firefighter emerged, carrying a small, dust-covered shoe in his gloved hand. The sight of it sent a shudder through the crowd, rippling outward like a shock-wave of grief. Silence fell, thick and absolute. The search grew heavier, slower, as rescuers descended deeper into the shattered basement, their boots sinking into layers of broken stone and splintered beams. Flashlights cut thin, streaks of light through the swirling smoke, illuminating fragments of hymn books, torn ribbons, and bits of scorched fabric that clung to the ruins like ghosts unwilling to release their hold. The heat lingered in pockets, radiating from the collapsed walls in waves that made the air feel thick and metallic. A firefighter knelt beside a fallen beam, brushing away debris with steady, solemn hands, knowing before he even uncovered the small, lifeless form beneath it that this scene would scar his memory forever. The silence between each discovery was profound, the kind of silence that stretches the human heart to its breaking point. Above ground, the crowd pressed closer, their faces pale beneath the layer of dust that had settled over the street. Women clutched one another tightly, rocking back and forth as though movement might keep grief from consuming them. Men stared ahead with hollow eyes, jaws clenched so tightly that veins rose along their temples, their bodies fighting to contain a rage too vast to name. A police officer tried to push back the gathering mass, his voice faltering as he ordered them to stand clear. He too felt the weight of the moment, though he would never say it aloud. Further down the sidewalk, a boy of no more than 10 stood gripping the hand of his grandmother, tears tracing clean paths down his soot-covered cheeks as he asked in a trembling whisper, "Why would someone do this?" She had no answer. All she could do was hold his hand tighter when the firefighters carried the first body from the ruins, wrapped in a white sheet that fluttered softly in the breeze. A sound rose from the crowd unlike anything heard that day. Not screaming, not shouting, but a deep, soul-torn moan that seemed to rise from the earth itself. Women fell to their knees. Men bowed their heads. The sheet, once pure, now smudged with ash and grief, seemed almost to glow in the harsh morning light. Reverend Cross stepped, Forward, as the rescuers laid the small form gently on the church lawn, his hands trembling as he reached out, his fingertips brushing the cloth with reverence. Behind him, more sheets were carried out, each one a blow to the community's heart, each one a reminder of innocence stolen with calculated cruelty. And in that moment, Birmingham changed forever, its sorrow lifting into the sky like smoke rising from a wound that could never truly heal. The lawn outside the church became a gathering place for grief, a sacred ground where tears fell as freely as prayers. Sheets lay side by side in the grass, small forms beneath them outlined faintly in the shifting light, and the morning breeze lifted the corners with a gentleness that felt like an apology from the world itself. Mothers hovered near the bodies, unable to step forward, unable to pull themselves away, caught in that terrible space between denial and recognition. One woman pressed her hands against her chest as though holding her heart in place, her breath catching every time the wind stirred the sheets. The pastor moved quietly among them, his voice hushed, his hands shaking as he whispered blessings over children who had arrived that morning dressed for celebration and now lay silent beneath an open sky. As word spread across Birmingham, people poured onto the street from every direction. Teachers with chalk still on their sleeves, steelworkers in soot-stained coveralls, nurses whose shifts had just ended but who ran anyway, drawn by the gravity of unspeakable tragedy. Some came in disbelief, others in fury, but all came with the same hollow ache pulling at their ribs. A man reached the churchyard and dropped to his knees, his hat falling from his hands as he stared at the still forms on the ground. His shoulders shook silently, though no tears fell. He had cried too many times for too many losses, and now only emptiness remained. A group of teenagers stood nearby, fists clenched, their anger burning like a slow fire behind their eyes. "They bombed our church," one said, voice raw. "They killed our girls." No one answered. There were no words big enough to carry the weight of the truth. Inside the shattered sanctuary, a team of rescuers continued to sift through rubble, the echoes of their movements mixing with distant sirens and the soft murmurs of prayer rising from the gathering crowd. Sunlight pierced through the jagged holes where stained glass had once glowed, illuminating floating dust like a snowfall made of memory and pain. One firefighter paused, leaning on a beam, as exhaustion and heartbreak folded his body forward. He removed his helmet, running a hand through his soot-covered hair, whispering something only he could hear, a prayer, a curse, a question. When he emerged from the church, the crowd parted, their eyes searching his face for hope he did not carry. He shook his head slowly, swallowing hard, and in that small motion the community felt its world crack a little more, the devastation spreading through them like a cold, relentless tide. Grief thickened the air like humidity before a storm, settling into the lungs of every person who gathered near the church, making breath itself feel heavy. Reporters began to appear at the edges of the crowd, cameras hanging from their necks, their hands trembling as they realized the magnitude of the story unfolding before them. Some raised their lenses slowly, almost reverently, as though afraid to disturb the sacredness of the moment. Others hesitated, the enormity of the tragedy freezing them in place. A journalist scribbled notes with shaking fingers, his eyes flicking from the shattered church windows to the trembling hands of a mother crouched in the grass. He had covered violence before, but nothing prepared him for the sight of innocence taken with such precision, such hatred, such cold deliberation. It was as though the city itself had been struck at its center, and everyone present could feel the wound bleeding through them. Across the street, police officers formed a line, their faces taut with unease. They carried the weight of the city's long history, a history that placed them not as protectors, but as enforcers of an order built on fear. Some officers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding the eyes of the community. Others stared straight ahead with a hardness meant to mask uncertainty. Among them stood a young patrolman, barely older than the teenagers watching from the church steps. He swallowed hard as he took in the scene, the broken, stained glass scattered across the pavement like the remnants of a dream blasted apart. He had grown up believing in duty, but now, confronted with the aftermath of a crime born from the same hatred that shaped the city he served, he felt something inside him crumble, a crack in the loyalty he once wore like armor. As the sun climbed higher, its light sharpened the devastation, illuminating every shattered brick and scorched fragment of wood as though refusing to let the world look away. The church bell, cracked by the force of the explosion, hung silently above the ruins, its silence louder than any toll. Women began to form a circle around the bodies, linking hands as their voices lifted into a wavering hymn. Slow, trembling, but determined, the melody wove itself through the air, threading sorrow with strength, grief with defiance. The sound drifted across the street, brushing against the officers, the reporters, the curious onlookers, carrying with it a message deeper than words. This violence will not silence us. This pain will not scatter us. This loss will become our fire, and from it we will rise. The song swelled slowly, gathering strength like a river rising after heavy rain, carrying the weight of every heart in that churchyard. Women closed their eyes as they sang, their tear-streaked faces lifted toward the sky, their voices trembling yet unwavering. The hymn wrapped itself around the ruins, weaving through the broken beams and shattered brick, settling gently over the still forms beneath the sheets. Men joined in next, their low voices merging with the women's in a sound that felt ancient, a sound born in fields, whispered in cabins, carried through chains, prayed over in secret. The harmony rose higher, shaking loose the dust that clung to the air, as if calling the world itself to witness the cruelty that had been done here. No bomb, no hatred, no hooded man could quiet a people who had learned to turn suffering into song. As the last notes drifted into silence, a sharp cry split the air. A mother recognizing the shoes beneath one of the sheets. Her body collapsed forward, a sound escaping her that seemed torn from the depths of the earth itself. Women rushed to her side, lifting her trembling form, holding her as her grief poured out in waves that shook her shoulders and bent her spine. A doctor tried to offer comfort, but his words dissolved in the heat of the moment. There are wounds that no training can touch. The crowd bowed their heads, some covering their mouths, others staring forward with eyes emptied of everything but sorrow. Near the edge of the lawn, a little girl clutched her father's hand and whispered, "Daddy, will God take care of them?" He knelt, pulling her close, his eyes shining with tears he refused to let fall. "Yes," he whispered, voice breaking. "Yes, baby, he already is." A silence settled over the gathering, not the hollow quiet of fear, but the heavy stillness of a community bracing itself against the tidal wave of what must come next. The fire trucks rumbled away, leaving behind the charred skeleton of a sanctuary that had stood for generations as a beacon of hope. Reporters exchanged low, urgent whispers, preparing to send news of this horror into the wider world. A single dove landed on the church's scorched ledge, its white feathers stark against the blackened brick, as if heaven itself had placed a witness there. Then, slowly, people began to stand taller, wiping their faces, straightening their shoulders. There was grief in their eyes, yes, oceans of it, but there was also something sharper, harder, forged in fire, resolve. For in the ashes of the fallen children, a truth had settled deep into every heart present. This bomb had not destroyed them, it had awakened them. As the crowd began to disperse, the city's leaders arrived, their faces carved into expressions of forced solemnity. They walked with stiff backs and clipped steps, conscious of the reporters' cameras following their every move. The mayor paused at the edge of the churchyard, staring at the ruined basement as though measuring the political cost more than the human one. Beside him, a police chief folded his arms over his chest, the morning sun glinting off the brass of his badge. His jaw tightened when he saw the grieving families gathered in small clusters, their whispered prayers winding through the air like smoke. The officials exchanged murmured words, their voices low, their eyes avoiding the sight of the tiny white shoes still lying in the grass. For all their stature, they stood as small as shadows before the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded. Inside the crowd, whispers rose like sparks blown from a fire. Conversations crackled with grief, fury and disbelief. Some spoke with trembling voices about the night riders, the white hoods, the history that had led them here, as if trying to thread order through something senseless. Others spoke of the girls with trembling hands pressed over their mouths, Addie Mae's laughter in Sunday school, Cynthia's quick steps dancing down the aisle, Carol's curious questions, Denise's shy smile. Memories of them drifted through the crowd like the soft flutter of hymnal pages, each memory a reminder of the life that hatred had tried to extinguish. People reached for one another, clasping hands, gripping arms, forming small circles of strength. The grief that had once scattered them now drew them into closer orbit, as if sorrow itself had become their shelter. Across the street, a group of young activists stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes burning with a fire no bomb could smother. They had marched before, been arrested before, been beaten before, but something in them shifted as they looked upon the broken church, a resolve that felt sharper, deeper, unbreakable. "This," one young man whispered, fists tightening at his sides, "this changes everything." A girl beside him nodded, tears staining her cheeks but anger straightening her spine. "If they think this will stop us," she said softly, "they don't know us at all." The group fell silent, watching as mothers knelt in the grass, as fathers held their families close, as the shattered sanctuary cast long shadows across the street. It was in that moment, through sorrow, through smoke, that they understood something profound. The movement had not lost its children, it had gained its martyrs, and that truth would propel them forward, with a strength born from heartbreak and holiness. As the sun dipped lower, its fading light brushed the church ruins with a soft, melancholy glow, turning the shattered brick into embers of memory. The street lamps flickered on one by one, their pale halos illuminating the lingering crowd, as though reluctant to surrender the day to darkness. Elderly men stood with hands clasped behind their backs, their silhouettes framed against the remnants of the sanctuary they had helped build with their own hands decades earlier. Their faces, lined by time and hardened by struggle, reflected a sorrow too deep for words, but also a quiet, simmering defiance. They knew what came next. Birmingham would pretend shock, politicians would offer rehearsed condolences, but justice would move only if ordinary people pushed it forward. And standing in the cooling twilight, they understood that the burden of that push now rested squarely on their shoulders. Inside the pastor's office, half collapsed, dust-filled, Reverend Cross stood staring at the charred remains of his desk, at the fragments of sermon notes scattered like burnt leaves across the floor. The room smelled of smoke, damp ash, and the faint, lingering trace of oil from the bomb. He bent slowly, lifting a corner of a photograph singed at the edges. The four girls smiling in their Sunday best, their eyes bright with hope. His breath caught, and he pressed the picture to his chest, feeling his heartbeat thunder beneath it. "Lord," he whispered, voice strained, "give me strength for what must come." Outside, he could hear the rising murmur of the community, their grief turning into something sharper, something that would soon need guidance. He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering himself, then stepped out into the evening air, knowing his role had just transformed from shepherd to leader of a wounded, awakening people. Night settled fully over Birmingham, cloaking the city in darkness that felt heavier than usual, as if grief itself had thickened the sky. But in the streets surrounding the ruined church, lights burned in windows, in porches, in the hands of those keeping a vigil. Families sat beside one another on front steps, speaking softly, their words weaving sorrow with memory, fear with determination. A young mother rocked her infant slowly, tears tracing silent pathways down her face. She was terrified of the world her child would grow into, yet the sight of her neighbors gathering outside brought her a fragile hope. Across the street, teenage boys stood watch at the corner, their stances protective, their eyes scanning the dark.